Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're so excited that so many of you could join us today for On the Practice of Presence for Healing Personal and Collective Grief. I'm Alex Elliott, the Senior Manager of Events and Engagement for the Public Programs Department of California Institute of Integral Studies, a nonprofit university in San Francisco. As many of us are descendants of settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those forcefully brought to this continent, we, CIIS Public Programs, must recognize and never forget that our university's building in San Francisco occupies traditional, unceded Ramaytush Ohlone lands. If you're interested in learning more about Native lands, languages, and territories, we encourage you to visit native-land.ca. Now let me first introduce our presenters, Michelle Cassandra Johnson and Janae Johnson, and then we'll get right to their conversation. Janae Johnson pioneered and leads the unique effort to bring mindfulness into public health practices and programs through the Trauma-Informed Systems of Care initiative in the San Francisco Department of Public Health. Janae is the founder of the Right Within Experience, a mindfulness immersion program that reclaims humanity, joy, and well-being for people of African ancestry through mindfulness practices. For 15 years, she served as the director of the San Francisco Black Infant Health Program, a program which provides direct service to Black pregnant women and new mothers to address the health disparities in infant and maternal mortality. She is a HeartMath certified trainer, certified professional coactive coach, and certified by the globally recognized Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute to teach mindfulness and emotional intelligence based on the latest neuroscience. She's also a keynote speaker, coach, and consultant with Sankofa Holistic Counseling Services in Oakland and on the advisory board of Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute. Michelle Cassandra Johnson is a social justice warrior, author, dismantling racism trainer, empath, yoga teacher and practitioner, and an intuitive healer. With over 20 years of experience leading dismantling racism work and working with clients as a licensed clinical social worker, Johnson has a deep understanding of how trauma impacts the mind, body, spirit, and heart. She has led dismantling racism trainings with large corporations, small nonprofits, and community groups, including the ACLU Washington, Duke University, Google, This American Life, the Center for Equity and Inclusion, Eno River Unitarian Universalist Church, Lululemon, and many others. And now it is my absolute pleasure to turn it over to Michelle and Janae.
Many different spaces is really about acknowledging where we've been, where we come from, what we have done to each other, the trauma we embody and how we replicate that trauma and pass it on to others. And so it was a natural fit, although I didn't know it at the time, but a natural fit to talk about grief and really collective grief, because I'm aware we are all losing something. We have lost so much and we will lose more unless we change our ways of being. So it feels really resonant and imperative that we focus on grief and make space for it and move through it together.
I work with Black women. I just recently was a keynote at a conference, I spoke about grief. I asked about grief. And the founder said, girl, I don't have time to grieve. And she also intimated that if she gave grief space, it would swallow her up. And so, how did you come to have the courage to face grief? And were you ever afraid to grieve?
Yes, I'm really happy you're bringing this into this space because it's important. We have internalized many messages about grief, about whether or not to make space for grief, who actually can grieve, whose grief will get attention, who is allowed to process their grief, has access to resources that will respond to the grief, who has to just endure and push through. So we have all sorts of conditioning that I feel like creates a lot of confusion about grief. And it is quite a common experience for people to feel like it's going to swallow them.
Mhm.
And I think this is in part because many of us are having to remember how to grieve and to pause and be still and to listen and to recognize that our grief is connected to others' grief. So I feel like it is brave and courageous to bring this forth in this way. And the experiences I've moved through of grief and loss chose me, right? And chose me in this way that allowed me to create and write a book all about collective grief and these different themes connected with grief. So there are practices. There's a chapter about our role, our right role at this time. There's a chapter about our intuition, a chapter about coming back into wholeness, a chapter about presence. All of these things are connected to our grieving process and attending to the heart, really, and caring for the heart. So the moment that I feel like I was chosen to do this was prior to receiving the specific information that I needed to create a space and then write a book, was when George Zimmerman was acquitted for murdering Trayvon Martin. And I was cracked open in a way I had not been. And I was also processing a lot of ancestral grief. I mean, that was what was moving through me. And I think my ancestors knew that I could come back into wholeness, but I didn't feel that at the time. I was afraid grief was going to swallow me, like it was going to take me out, and the world and what was happening was going to do that. And that's not what happened. Like, I'm here and have connected with community and deepened this conversation and my ancestors and nature to hold me through this. And these are some of the practices I feel like we need to engage at this time.
Tell me more about the experiences of grief that you've had and how you moved through them. You have wonderful stories in this book, so many great stories. Your dad, moving through, taking your mom through her illness, the death of your grandmother, your friend Eric. Girl, I was on this ride with you, okay? I just want to say it's beautifully written. As I said in the opening, it was a heartful reading, and I am going to come back to the whole notion of the heart, but I'd love for you to tell us one of your stories.
Well, yes, there are so many stories. The story I want to tell is about chapter 6. There's a chapter about the bees, and I am a beekeeper. I have 3 beehives. I don't own them. They're on my land with me, and we're in deep relationship with one another. And honeybees are such a metaphor for, and a teacher really, for what we need to do for each other, with each other. And the story of the bees, the essence of it is the bees came to me when my mother was sick. They came to me on purpose. I had never taken a beekeeping class before. And I woke up and ordered bees and all of the things. And a friend said they work in the material realm and the spiritual realm, and they're here to help your mother transition. She did not transition, but she was close. Everyone thought that's what was happening, and so did she. And so they taught me throughout that time so much about grief, about sweetness, about resources and sustenance, about nature and our relationship with nature, and about what it means to care for the hive. And in the story in chapter 6, I lost a hive, which is common during winter time, but it was the first time it had happened to me. And they left us so much honey. So we had to harvest sweetness in the middle of responding to death and loss. And isn't that what we're trying to do now, right? So intensely now, but all of the time. And it was such a it was just a deep experience to be with both. Like they left us this gift of sweetness and medicine. And I have to honor what it is to see a hive that is no longer thriving and alive. And the bees are such good teachers because they're for social justice, because everything they do is for the hive. They don't think of themselves as individuals. They think of themselves as an extension of the hive, and everything is for the entire hive, the wholeness of the hive. And I feel like there's so much that we can learn from them. And the other part of this story, which is not in the book because I was reminded of it later, is that there is an old practice in many cultures and traditions where people are supposed to go tell the bees when they've lost someone or lost something, so the bees can mourn with them. And it's happened all over the world. It's an old practice. And so I have an article about it. It's really interesting to think about communing with nature in that way, and being with the bees and allowing them to mourn with us, to move with us, to help us move through. And I think that's what finding refuge is about in so many ways. How do we find refuge amid the chaos in the world, the suffering that we feel, the collective suffering, the cultural trauma? So that's some about the bees, and that they all have a role in supporting the hive. And there's some questions in that chapter about, what would it be like for us to think about ourselves as part of a hive? And I think we're being asked that question. I mean, the question's kind of being screamed at us right now over and over, like, are we going to take care of each other is what we're being asked right now. And how are we going to do it? And are we willing to do it? And are we willing to remember how interconnected we are?
That is so beautiful. I love the whole notion of in the face of death, in the face of loss, yet harvesting sweetness. I know when in my own work, when I turn to my ancestors, and I keep a picture of my grandfather on my refrigerator, and one day in frustration, I'm like, what do you want me to do with this? And my family's from the Caribbean, and I heard deep in my soul, take what I have left you and make something of yourself. That's how in his voice, what he would say. So it was not pick up my sorrow, take the sweetness, take the goodness of what I have left you, and go make something of yourself. So I will definitely take that with me. I love that you also call on the ancestors so much. That is throughout your book. And I wasn't going to ask you this until later on, but we're going to talk about this now. The ancestors. So there's two parts to this. The ancestors and our connection to them is a very African principle. What has happened to us in that? Where is the fracture? How have we lost that?
This is such a big question, right? And wondering, how have we lost this? And so much of it, in my opinion, has to do with colonization and how we were brought here, and the pattern of splitting people apart and families apart. So language and culture and traditions were lost and not passed on. And I also think in my own family, the pain of living through my great grandparents were enslaved, and my great grandmother remembers slavery as a child, although she wasn't enslaved. But I feel like she was living through that and with that because her mother was. She didn't know her father because her family had been split apart. But I feel like, this experience of I was trying to remember where I was going with the enslaved. The ancestors are probably working through me. I think the pain, this is where I was going, the pain of of that, my family didn't want to pass that down. So my great grandmother didn't want to talk to my grandfather about it. My grandmother, maternal grandmother, didn't want to talk about how hard times were. My mother, although we have opened a conversation, she says it's too painful. And so I feel like not having that conversation about the suffering and pain also disconnects us from the rituals that might help us heal. So there's the loss from colonization, but the loss because it's a challenge to turn towards the amount of suffering we've experienced as Black people, and how we were brought here. And I think capitalism, like we're not encouraged to practice, to be engaged in ritual, to be connected with ancestors, to deepen our relationship with them. And to see ourselves as living ancestors. This is the other thing. We are living ancestors. We're preparing in time to transition. And how do we want to be in this lifetime? And what do we want to leave?
Yes. So it's the sense of connection from the past to the present. And where are we on the timeline, and how will we pass the baton on to the future? But as you were talking, I was thinking about what a gift these rituals and practices are in your book, because what it allows us to do, what they allow us to do, is to face that pain actually so that we can reach past it. Because our history is way, has a much longer trajectory than the 400 and some odd years of enslavement. We are the first people. I don't know if I'm going to math properly, but at least 300,000 years ago, we were the only people on the face of the earth. And if you look at the human timeline, 400 years is a blip in the time. And so just as you were talking, I was getting that, if we take these practices and properly move through this pain, we can reach past it to grab and harvest the sweetness. Yes, that is ours to have. Mm-hmm. So, girl, that's how I'm going to be teaching your book. I've already started holding it up in my meetings. And so that's another beautiful nugget. The grief helps us to process so that we can harvest the sweetness, because there is so much sweetness that is past, even our present heartache, and what we know from our history of enslavement. Mm-hmm. You talk a lot about the heart, and this is so yummy to me as a heart math trainer. You bring heart math into the space, and I actually was going to open up with a simple heart math practice, and I just totally forgot. But you land us, you take us, it's in the title, Finding Refuge, Heart Work for Healing Collective Grief. You land us in the heart. Tell me about your love affair with the heart.
Well, I'm a Leo.
All right, this is your season too.
Yes, and we're ruled by the heart, and it is my season. And the heart has to do with courage and vulnerability, and compassion, right, for ourselves and others. So I think I have been in love with the heart for a long time and deeply connected to my heart. When I was a child, I was a serious child, my mother would say, and I was sensitive. And so I was sensitive to disconnection, and I would even want to bring people home that I perceived to be alone, and they weren't. Like I was sensitive to what's happening in this world, and how are we misaligned, and why aren't we talking to each other? And I mean, I was like 6 doing this, right? I was very young, present to my heart and what I noticed, and the heartbreak that created, and the heartbreak other people embodied, and they may not have known they embodied the heartbreak. So I feel like we have to get into the heart, and it's not just about having a good heart. Like it's working with the heart. It is like, what does it mean to be courageous at this time to create conditions for everyone to thrive? What does it mean to have the courage to speak the truth about our history and what is playing out now? What does it mean to extend care to everyone, right? And not just think about my sovereignty, but our collective care. And I think the heart is the entry point. And the way I wrote about it in Finding Refuge is about intuition too. Like the heart is guiding us if we deepen our practice of connecting with it. And so much of dominant culture takes away our connection with the heart. And what would it be like for us to be so connected to the heart? We would change everything. We wouldn't be engaged in heartless behavior or patterns of trauma or oppression. So as I said, it's deeper than I'm a good person, I have a good heart. It's how are you practicing with your heart? How is your heart showing up? How is your heart guiding you? So this is how I think about the heart.
That's beautiful, because what we know is that the heart sends more messages to the brain than the brain to the heart. So, in the sacred text, when it says, guard your heart, for out of it are the issues of life, that it is out of the heart are the issues of life. So this disconnection, I'm hearing you say, that we're living collectively in white delusional supremacist culture is part of the malaise, part of the disease that ails us. Can you say more about white supremacist culture, the dominant culture, and how that has programmed us, how that has interrupted this engagement with the heart?
Mm-hmm. So white supremacy, and I have a shared language section in Finding Refuge because language is important and powerful. As I understand white supremacy, it's an ideology and belief system that white is superior, and that being Black, Indigenous, person of color is inferior. It's deeply connected to the racial hierarchy as well, which, race was constructed for social and political reasons. It's not a real thing. And yet we are responding to the hierarchy of race that was constructed by white men of property at the time. And this is why we're so embedded and white supremacy is so entrenched in everything and embedded in the foundation of how we came to be at this time and why we are operating in the way we are. And I'm also aware that white supremacy doesn't really want any of us to make it. It's like, white people are benefiting from it, but spiritually and on a soul level, white supremacy is not like out to save our spirits. Like that's not what it wants to do. It wants us to divide us from ourselves, which means a disconnection from the heart. It wants to divide us from each other, people who are like us and people who are different. And it set up this whole idea that white is superior. And that has been institutionalized. It is the culture, right? People talk about the culture as the air, the water we're swimming in. It's part of everything. It's infused in our culture and our way of being. And so part of our practice needs to be to understand, how does white supremacy live inside me? How is white supremacy working on me? What patterns of white supremacy am I replicating? And even as a Black woman, I internalize messages. So I've internalized racial oppression because of white supremacy and racism, because those things are in place. And that means I can replicate systems of oppression or patterns of white supremacy based on what white supremacy is telling me about who I am, which, white supremacy gives me very negative messages about myself and other Black people and other people of color. So it's everywhere. And I think there's this tendency to, and I've noticed I'm in a lot of spaces that are mixed. There's a tendency in a lot of spiritual spaces to bypass the reality of what is happening and the harm white supremacy has caused and continues to cause. And I feel like, in these spiritual places and spiritual practices, that they really call us into seeing how white supremacy is active, and then call us into what do we want to do to disrupt it, to dismantle it. So I would invite people to look at where it is inside them and others and institutions and culture, instead of saying I'm not a white supremacist, right? It's not inside me. It's inside of everyone. We're all implicated in this system.
So how, as a social justice warrior, how are these this programming, these set of behaviors impacting the social justice movement? How, because if it's it's inside, how has it impacted the movement toward liberation?
what flashed into my mind is I years ago worked in a nonprofit and went in one day, and I think the restroom wasn't working in the building and we didn't have anywhere else to go. And the institution was like, but you need to stay and work. Productivity was prioritized over our like personal needs, right? Over relationship, over the clients that were coming in. And I thought, this is deeply problematic, right? So there are things like productivity and workaholism, right? And binary thinking there, and competition and power hoarding. All of these things are connected to white supremacy. And how I see them show up in social movements and organizing is that we can show up for the cause. Like I showed up in that nonprofit that day to do the work, and we can devote our entire lives to the work at the expense of ourselves and the collective good, ultimately, because we can't continue to be in service of the collective good if we're not working to sustain ourselves, to center ourselves, to be grounded, so we can continue to show up. And I think this lends itself to replicating systems of oppression. So to prioritize the cause over the people who are like doing the work. And I know movements, and I wrote about this, movements began because they come from a space of grief and loss, right? Of something being taken away or never given to us based on our different identities, that then we're called into action to create a movement to respond to that, which is why we need to center grief. We need to practice rituals as we show up. For our organizing and our work with one another, we need to ground and center. And that's missing from almost every organizing space that I'm part of or have been a part of, that we don't take time to practice together. And then we expect to show up grounded and ready to do the work. And really, we show up in a messy way. And one of these ways is replicating white supremacy.
This was one of the pieces in your book that I was just in here doing a happy dance. I just felt like this, she knows my heart, because this is these are the principles that I have founded the Right Within experience on, which is for the reclamation of humanity, joy, and well-being for people of African ancestry, to reclaim our humanity as we are doing this work, that we cannot do the work without this. So I just want to read a piece from your book. Okay, this is page 58 and 59. I'm actually going to hold it up because if folks don't have the book, okay, you need to get it. I think some of you are getting it through your package, but I love how you describe this here. You said, collectives die when we don't prioritize healing, integrity, and wholeness as much as we prioritize the work. So this is underscoring what you just said. Many nonprofits and social change spaces are in the business of addressing what is so desperately flawed in our culture, while at the same time replicating the patterns they are trying to disrupt. This can show up as workaholism, a lack of empathy, a practice of protecting dysfunctional behavior at the expense of everyone in an organization, power hoarding, perfectionism, a lack of self and collective care, little to no time for staff to connect, and valuing productivity over centering relationship with staff and community. I'm underscoring this because we are at a place in the movement where it is not about can we drink at the same water fountain. We're at the place of the most difficult part of the work, which is dismantling how oppression shows up in the institutions, in policy, practices, procedures, behavior. And I wanted to really underscore that for our listening, because it is so easy to say, I'm conscious, I'm woke, or whatever the dialogue is, and yet perpetuate the system. And I really appreciate that you called attention to these systems, that we must slow down. It requires us to slow down. And it also requires us to face our broken hearts. And you speak about that quite a bit. One of the reasons why people are afraid to step into a grief practice is because they think that inside of the grief, they will lose their wholeness. But you say that we can be brokenhearted and whole at the same time. Can you please speak to that?
Mhm. You know, we have I was just talking about this in a session earlier, the capacity to have a broken heart, not be broken, but have a broken heart and have an open heart. And part of the reason we have a broken heart is because we're open and alive and awake to what is happening. Right? If we're present to what's happening, our heart's going to feel some pain, some suffering, what we would call brokenheartedness, some empathy, some connection. And this speaks to our capacity to open the heart and extend compassion and grace, right? And it speaks to our will and ability to show up and engage and change how things are going, and we must. And so I feel like there's a fear about, I mean, we talked about the heart. Dominant culture doesn't want us to connect with the heart, and there's a fear about the heart and what's present. And what I know is if I don't process the brokenheartedness, there's more brokenheartedness on top of more brokenheartedness. And eventually I'm immobile, like I can't move. And so do people want to hold the heaviness, or do they want to acknowledge what's present and allow themselves to move through it? And not alone, but with support, whatever that looks like. There's so many different ways to acknowledge our grief and tend the heart, care for the heart. So we're many things at once. And I mentioned binary thinking as connected to white supremacy and dominant culture. We feel a full range of emotions and experiences, the sweetness and the loss that we spoke about earlier, right? And holding both at the same time. And what I call holding these multiple truths and experiences at the same time. So we can be both brokenhearted and open-hearted. And we need to work to shift that it's one or the other, or brokenheartedness is somehow going to close the heart, when really it means the heart is so vast and massive, and it speaks to our capacity to love.
I so appreciate how you make the distinction between being broken and brokenhearted, that they're not the same. Is there a distinction between grieving and suffering?
This is a really good question. I mean, in my experience, my grief is in response to the suffering, because the suffering points to some ways we are out of alignment or integrity, and we're not caring for each other or the planet, and many other things, right? That the suffering that we feel because of thought patterns and cognitions and things that have happened to us and what we've internalized, and narratives that have been told to us that we believe that are not actually true. I mean, there are many ways we're trapped and suffering, and grief is in response to that. It's like, oh, I'm going to turn towards the suffering, and that means it's likely I need to make space for my grief.
I'm really present to how you are reshaping the whole narrative. That we actually have, through the heart, the power, if you will, to face the grief. The heart is not weak. It is sensitive, yes, but it is not weak. And we have the power to face the grief and transform it into something that is going to allow us to live and to flourish and to do the work and become the people that we really desire to be. So that the grief is actually not to be avoided. It's a tool for the liberation. It's a tool for liberation.
Yes.
Have
absolutely.
transformed the whole conversation. That's beautiful.
Thank you for reflecting that back to me. And I mean, so much of what I offer in Finding Refuge is the connection between grief and liberation, that we acknowledge the conditions that are in place that get in the way of us being whole, which means we move through grief and then we move into wholeness, right? And so I appreciate you reflecting that back. And the heart, the strength of the heart, the resilience it really made me think about, there's a mantra in the book, in chapter 1 with the practice, which is, I feel my heart. And I feel my heartbeat. I acknowledge my heart. I acknowledge my heartbeat. My heartbeat is connected to my mother's, to my grandmother's, to my great grandmother's, right? That's contained inside of my heart. And I know there may be feelings about ancestry for different folks listening to this. And one of my teachers, Lama Rod Owen, says, there was a healthy ancestor somewhere in there, somewhere in the line, there was a healthy ancestor, and their heartbeat is contained in your heartbeat. So I think that's really powerful to remember, because it speaks to our ability to weather this, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I love that. When I was pregnant with my son many years ago, he's 25, but you go for the ultrasound and you just see this little blob, and the heart develops before the brain. So you see in this little mass of whatever, the heart was just going. And this is such a wonderful thing to know. The heart developed before the brain. Mm-hmm. Now, I love that you said there had to be a healthy ancestor back there somewhere, because one of my questions was around this process of calling on the ancestors. And my question was, the white ones too? You feel me, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I do. And when I work with folks in mixed groups around ancestry, there's often resistance from white-bodied folks, which I can hear, right? It's not my experience, but I can hear that because I'm on the receiving end of white supremacy, of course. And people want to distance from that, or there's deep trauma in our lines, right? Regardless of race, we're moving with trauma because of history. And I do believe at some point for white-bodied people, there was a healthy ancestor. They don't know the story and they may not remember, but they can call on their healthy ancestors to support us in moving through this time, right? That this is a practice we can call on. And I think it's I'm going to say dangerous, actually, for white-bodied people to feel like I'm going to completely disconnect from my ancestors and my history and my lineage, because then it means in their own healing process, there isn't an opportunity to heal their line. And really, I think we do ancestral work to remember the strength of the heart, but also to heal our line. Yes. So that we can heal in present time, so that we can leave a different planet for the people that will come after us, the beings that will be here after us. So I would invite people to, for me, I believe there are ancestors waiting to support us. And I think white-bodied people have at least one ancestor somewhere, right? And I will say that if working with ancestors in your line is a challenge, the earth is an ancestor. There are living ancestors here. Connect with nature if it feels like you need that practice first before you call on people. And again, there are many reasons people may not want to go into ancestry. I understand that. I hear it. And there are many ancestors around us. Elemental energy is the elements are right, an ancestor. So we can practice in many ways.
That's delicious. Thank you for that, because I think that is permission, and it's liberation, and it's also loving. It is loving. So I want to ask you, is forgiveness then a part of grief?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it can be. And there's a story about my dad in Finding Refuge, and we had a very complicated relationship. And I tell a story of him sharing a story with me of trauma and being with his tenderness and feeling tender myself. And then in his passing, feeling complete. Like I felt like I had done the work, to show up in the way that I needed to show up for him. And I didn't want to hold on to his trauma. So I did go through a process of forgiveness, right? Because that's energy that will stagnate in my spirit. And I actually want my spirit to be free. So that's what I want as I move through the world, and people to feel my spirit and divinity. And so forgiveness certainly can be part of that. Forgiving the self can be part of it for how I've shown up and contributed to suffering, right? Which again, grief is in response to the suffering. And then can I forgive myself and decide how I want to show up in a different way? So I think it definitely is part of the process of grieving.
It's beautiful. What have you forgiven yourself for?
For what I didn't know. And I want to be clear, I'm a learner. I'm curious. I mean, like I'm curious about so many things and about what this human experience is like, and you know, the expansiveness of our spirits outside of the bodies. I'm curious. And I've been leading anti-racism work and being in community and organizing for over 20 years. And there was a point when I didn't know. Like, I didn't know the degree of suffering. I didn't have words for it. I felt it. It was embodied, but I couldn't speak to it. Or when I caused harm based on race or based on other identities against other people, because I wasn't listening, or I was silencing, or I wasn't prioritizing, or I was engaging in white supremacist behaviors, the ones we named earlier, right? Or I was being silent instead of speaking up. And so I've forgiven myself for what I didn't know, because we are learning. And this is important for people who have been conditioned. White supremacy also conditions us to be perfect and to know. And so if we feel like we can show up and like go to one training and get all of the skills that we need to raise our consciousness and change the world, that's going to set us up. It's an ongoing practice. And I feel like that speaks to how we are engaged in this process of learning for the long haul. And I would invite people who are like, I don't know what to do because it needs to be perfect, to be in that space of curiosity and to forgive themselves for what they didn't know before, even if harm happened.
Yes.
Because not forgiving oneself, ultimately, I think it will cause more harm because it's causing more suffering.
Yes, that's beautiful. You told a story about Eric Garner, which is very interesting to me because I'm from Staten Island, New York, where Eric Garner was murdered. I know the corner. I've been there a million times. And so often in my practice and when I'm doing keynotes, etc., I will dedicate it to Eric because I just feel that connection. I'm from Staten Island. And one of the things you say is that oppression takes our breath away. So how do we catch our breath? How do we reclaim the breath? When so many, in Eric's case particularly, he said, I can't breathe, I can't breathe, I can't breathe.
Yeah, I remember watching the video, which I was not in the practice of doing because these experiences are deeply traumatic and triggering, and for some reason was called to watch it. And was sitting in my office. I was a therapist at the time. I remember sitting at the desk. I remember the kind of computer I had and watching the video and feeling, I mean, there were so many things that were horrific about that. And one of them, of course, was his life being taken away. It was also how people treated him as he was dying, and how people wouldn't touch him, right? The paramedics wouldn't touch him. And I just thought, I know that has happened before. It had happened before. And there's something that struck me about how disassociated people were and not in their humanity, right? Yes. Even as this person was just murdered and dying, their dignity was taken away, right? And so I went in to teach a yoga class right after watching that. And the words came out of my mouth, oppression takes the breath away. And I wasn't planning on it. That wasn't the meditation we were going to move through. And Spirit said, we live in a culture where oppression takes the breath away. And we were engaged in a practice to connect us with the breath, which really connects us with our shared humanity, right? Our humanity and our collective humanity. And I think we reclaim the breath by working through the trauma, because trauma makes us hold our breath, right? And this conditioning around like being contained and having it all together, and that perfectionism I was talking about, and not prioritizing relationship and people, right? This is, I mean, it's so constraining to us, and it doesn't really allow us to be in our humanity. And so I also think about years later, I think it was about a year later after saying oppression takes the breath away, I said it's a radical act to breathe. And that is in response to moving through this trauma and knowing that I hold my breath because white supremacy wants me to hold my breath. And it wants lots of people who are marginalized to hold their breath. And it makes us hold our breath. We're like bracing for the next thing to happen. We're experiencing anticipatory grief, right? Because we're experiencing PTSD. Many of us are. And so I feel like we practice, we reconnect, we take the space to breathe. We notice the ways in which beings are not able to breathe. What conditions are in place that make it challenging for people to have access to the breath? And not just an inhale and an exhale. I think about the breath as the inhale, exhale, the physical, the emotional, the mental, the spiritual, the psychic, our whole being, which is really about liberation and freedom, like that we get to be free and move with ease in our lives because we can breathe with ease.
You speak a lot about the spirit. What is your spiritual practice?
I practice many things. I'm a yoga teacher and practitioner, and learner in yoga, studying the different texts and teachings. And my practice that I engage in every day is prayer. My altars are actually behind me. There's an ancestor altar and another altar. And I sit in front of the altar and meditate. I speak to the ancestors and I ask them what they want me to know. I ask them what they want to, because reciprocity is important. So like yesterday I made rose tea for my grandmother. She's because that's what I heard. She's never asked for that before, but that is what she heard, which makes sense. That's all about the heart and compassion. I think it was her way of being like, I see you doing the heart work. That's just coming to me now, but I think that's why. I use different divination tools. I journal, I write gratitude statements. So this is the practice every day. And I also move in my body and breathe in my body because I do believe it's a radical act for me to breathe in this Black body in a world that doesn't want me to breathe. And I call on spirit a lot. So much feels too big for me. Because the world is overwhelming. And I call on spirit and say, I can't hold all of this. I don't know what to do with this. And I know there's something bigger than me guiding me and us. So I'm going to call on spirit. And I also recognize my own spirit. Like, as I said earlier, I'm not just this body. And it helps me to remember I am spirit. This is what the texts say. The Bhagavad Gita is the text I work with a lot and I'm so drawn to. Because it's so relevant to what's happening here. And there's so many teachings in there about our divinity, our spirit as connected to the larger self and God. And this helps me feel like I can do what I need to do in the world. Because if I just think about this body and its limitations, it actually can feel constraining and be a challenge to show up in this bigness, right? This way we are showing up together now. And so I need to remember I'm spirit and that spirit is here with me, guiding me.
Yes, that's so beautiful. I recently listened to a talk by the late, great historian, John Henrik Clarke. And he talked about how the African always knew that there was something bigger. And I think that this is one of the wonderful things that we have gotten to carry through with us through the Middle Passage and on, no matter what practice we have chosen, there's this awareness that there is something bigger and to call upon that for help. That's beautiful. So how do you rest? How do you rest?
I think rest is so important and it's a practice, like the practice I went through and just shared with you. And I have a practice of yoga nidra. One of my teachers, Tracy Stanley, who I love Tracy, she wrote a book that's called Radiant Rest. And it's all about yoga nidra, which is deep rest and relaxation, but really to connect us with our higher consciousness and higher self. And in so many ways, I think to connect with the ancestors and the wisdom that needs to move through or that wants to move through us. So I practice that. I've started to practice sound bathing more. There's something vibrationally going on that I was drawn to, and I'm getting certified to do that. So I've been listening to those every day and being still. And rest is hard for me because I'm so committed, devoted to my Dharma. I do take time for myself. So not at the expense of myself, but I'm passionate about what I do and how I get to be in space with people and show up and the things we get to talk about. Which means sometimes I'm not resting as much as I need to rest. But I've, for example, this year I've blocked out all the time off that I've like made sure, because it will just get filled up with things. And so I want time for myself and rest in nature too. Nature is, when I was cracked open in a profound way, nature was the only thing that made sense. It was like, there's a cycle in nature and it's bigger than me. And that mountain is there and I can climb. It was the only thing. And the seasons change. And so nature is a place where I rest as well.
That's beautiful. You're in North Carolina, so you do get the 4 seasons, yes?
Yes.
And do you go out walking trails?
Yes.
Places?
I have a dog.
We saw Jasper.
Oh, he is so much medicine. He's right next to me. I love him. And he's like heard all of these things from our conversation, right? So he's wise. He's on his meditation cushion, but I go outside on trails. I have 3 big tulip poplars around my house and I go and they're huge. They're the protectors of the house. So I go out and connect with them. I go out and connect with the bees, and I have chickens too. So I go hang out with them and garden, but I move in nature. Yes. And there's a mountain called Pilot Mountain that's about 20 minutes away from me. And I go there a lot to climb that mountain. And there's something very soothing about that space. It's the space I would go to a lot when I was cracked open on the floor, grieving, did not know what was happening to me. I was called to go to that mountain over and over. So that's some of how I connect with nature.
That's beautiful. Can you tell me, how do you play?
I laugh a lot. I am in community. I've really good community here and actually all over the place. That's been a challenge because of COVID and social isolation, but still connecting with folks. I have a partner who's a chef who cooks for me, and he's silly and he makes me laugh all of the time. And so that, and Jasper, he reminds me to be light. At times he's like devoted and serious too about his job of protecting me, but he also reminds me to be light and laugh and to play. I talk to my mom and laugh and storytell. So I do play a lot for sure.
So there's this beautiful balance between, because as I have said it, I mean this from the heart. I love this book. I love the way you formed it, that you prepare us with the shared language section, that you enrich it with so many stories. The practices are so accessible. There's a vulnerability there. And you do not shy away from just naming the challenge of white supremacy. You have really, this book is beautiful. I just feel like crying right now. It's so gorgeous.
Thank you.
Can you tell us about that process? Because you took these huge things and you put them all together. I'm in awe. I think that's a good word. There's an awe. And I even said to my husband, okay, so this is the book. She wrote this book. Get out of my head, Michelle. That's how I felt.
I love it. Thank you for your being engaged with my book in this way. And me, you know what? I want to tell you that I didn't know about heart math before I wrote the book. And I was writing the article about intuition and guided to look up and found information. So it's, synchronous that we're here together.
Yes.
In this way. I was like, oh, that was why I looked for that, because later I was going to be here in this way. I feel like the experiences I share in finding refuge happened on purpose and prepared me for this journey of writing this book, prepared me for the shamanic journey I went through as I wrote it. And I built altars for every person I wrote about. I was guided to write in a specific room at specific times of the day, and I had to build an altar For Eric's chapter about intuition and the heart, I had to go outside and build a fire. So I was really engaged with them, and they helped. I mean, these are their stories. They helped me, supported me in channeling this book and offering. And I do feel like there is a balance of my story and the details of it, and then our story. So I want people to see themselves in this.
Yes.
And also see the ways we're moving differently in the world, but see themselves in these stories, and then the collective too. So it always, each chapter goes back to how we're interconnected and are interdependent on one another, and invites us to think about our choices and what we're doing and what we want to do, and our capacity to reimagine and change. So I loved the process because I was working with the ancestors the entire time.
I'm so inspired for my own work. The other thing that I really appreciated about your book is you told the stories of Black men, including your dad. So how did that come to be? I just really appreciated that you presenced the masculine here.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to remember when that came to me, the needing to write the story about my father, and there's some information story about my grandfather in there too, and grandparents in the chapter about my grandmother and Eric, of course, but who wasn't, he was a white man, he wasn't a Black man, but the masculine is in it in that way. It felt really important to both center different experiences of grief and also different identities. And I feel like often we're not conditioned to grieve, but in particular, male identified folks are not conditioned to grieve. So it felt important to humanize him too, because he wasn't like great in his parenting role. And it felt important to humanize him and explain how complex we really are, and to also illustrate how one can be in the practice of showing up for someone when they don't show up in their wholeness and their fullness, and that affects someone. So it felt important to bring in these different voices, and he clearly called to be in the book because there's an entire chapter about him, which is about coming into wholeness, which is what he wanted, what he needed, and what he wanted.
That is so beautiful, and it is also in my mind a direct response to the whole issue of perfectionism, that we can love even those that are imperfect. And so I really appreciate that. I'm going to take a moment to check our Q&A and see what people are asking here. It says, first question, what are some ways we can connect to our heart in our daily practice around grief, be it personal or collective grief?
I'm sure we both have thoughts on this. And one thought I have is, and it's the first practice that I mentioned earlier, is checking in with the heart. So a daily practice could be breathing and being for however long you can do it, and saying, how is my heart today? Or even, you don't have to ask that, touching the heart, putting your hand on the heart if you're able to do that, or bringing your awareness to the heart, or breathing and imagining the breath touching the heart, right? Moving the heart, beating the heart. So I think this is one way that I practice it every day, is how is my heart today? And I ask other people too. That's the collective. I ask other people I'm in relationship with, how is your heart? Which is not a question that I get asked very much by others, because when I ask this question, I'm really wanting people to tell me how they are in a world that's like, move fast, and you don't have time to hear, and you can't hold what someone's going to say to you anyway. And it's not true. So I would say that. And the other thing that's coming through is, there are different elements, crystals, energies that work with the heart. So if you have rose quartz, you might bring that into your space, or rose colored things. I'm thinking about the chakras connected to the heart. Green is actually the color connected to the heart, but I think of rose and red and compassion as well. So you might call things in from nature that remind you of the heart, bringing them into your space, having them somewhere on an altar that you build, or connecting with them and journaling about them.
It's beautiful. And there's the basic heart math practice, which is called heart focused breathing, which is focusing your attention on the area of the heart. Imagine your breath flowing in and out of your heart or chest area, breathing a little slower and deeper than usual. And this is kind of the essential component, the baseline practice of heart math that allows us to establish a calm but alert state and helps us to shift into some kind of composure and balance so that we can just hear what is happening. So that's what I would offer as well. I'm going to come back to the questions. Janae, you referenced the sacred text. That's the Bible I was talking about, the Holy Bible, that talks about guard your heart. And I want to say that it's in one of the Psalms or in Proverbs, but I can't call the verse directly. But it is in the Holy Bible that talks about guard your heart, for out of it are the issues of life. And so that is my spiritual practice. I have a Christ-centered faith, and I use the Bible. And there is a distinction between empire Christianity, that machine, if you will, that was used to land grab, enslave, promote colonialism, etc., versus a true, alive relationship with God, and an understanding of Christ consciousness. So just wanted to offer that. And next question. For those who are new to connecting to ancestors, especially if there are fraught fractures in the line, how do you start the process? What are some pathways to acknowledge, engage, heal the line? And you did speak to that. Is there anything you'd like to review?
I just want to stress that when we prioritize our healing with an awareness that our healing will affect other beings, that will work to heal the line too. Because when we're working on our trauma, we have to be working on some of the ancestral trauma that's embodied too, and unbinding and unwinding, and seeing what's present. And as I've said multiple times, deciding what we want to let go. And so I would add that to what I shared earlier, and to be gentle and to take time. Like, if it's new to build a relationship with ancestors, relationships take time.
Yes.
So remembering this as we engage, and I think asking for protection as you engage if there are fractures in the line, because you want to be held and protected as you heal yourself and invite healing for the bloodline as well.
That's beautiful. And I also think, in that same vein, knowing that as you heal, you are sending out to the next group someone who is not fractured, someone who is tender, someone who is open, someone who has engaged with courage. Yes. And so all healing is good healing. I'm going to look for the next question. Do you feel like significant and lasting change has really happened in the last 14 to 16 months as far as shifting structural racism?
This is a question a lot of people are curious about. And it's a question I hold too. Because when I think about shifting structural racism, I think about shifting culture, and it takes a long time to shift culture. The patterns we were talking about connected with dominant culture, or that dominant culture engenders. And so I think an awakening happened for people as a global pandemic was happening and is still happening, right? I think an awakening of the horrors whole groups of people have been experiencing for a long time. People raise their consciousness about that. And my question is, what do we need to practice to stay awake? Because I think there's so much to make us go back to sleep, and there's a risk if we go back to sleep, we'll lose more. And so I'm not sure. I don't think I know yet. I think it's going to take more time to really know if there's change. If more people are talking about racism around their dinner tables with their families, in their organizations, in their communities, if people are doing work on themselves as well, again, with an awareness, we're interconnected. I keep saying that on purpose because it's not just about the inner work, it's also about the outer work as well, and our work as connected with other people. So I think there are more people doing that kind of transformative work. This is what I've seen in my spaces, and wanting to show up and maybe not knowing how, but I think it's going to take a long time for us to really know, have we effectively dismantled some of these structures?
I agree. This didn't happen overnight, and 14 to 16 months is not a long time. And unfortunately, you cannot legislate love. But we can, as we're seeing, like with voter suppression and other things, you can legislate hate, if I would use that word so strongly. And there are many people who are not interested in change. I'm friends with some of them on Facebook, honey, for this very reason, so I can understand what is happening over there. And that is what breaks my heart. That breaks my heart when I read some of the posts that I read. And that is what I find discouraging. So let's see. But on the same, like you said, we're not binary. So at the same token, I have your book. It's just a hot mess, sister.
It is a hot mess. It's all the things.
It's
all the things.
It's all the things. Let's see. Next question. What are some ways that you see organizations effectively incorporating a grief practice?
I love this question because it's important. And as we spoke about it earlier, related to organizing and social change movements, and building capacity for social change. I feel like the book that's coming to mind, actually, it's been around for a long time, is Trauma Stewardship. And I love it. I used to have it be part of my teacher training curriculum, because I was like, we're stewarding trauma. That is what we're doing as we hold people and move them and invite them to breathe. And we're doing this in our workspaces, right? Our communities, our organizations. So an awareness that trauma is present is one way that I see organizations working on this. Slowing down, which we spoke about. Engaging rituals, asking people how they are at the beginning of the meetings instead of jumping into the thing, whatever the thing is, but humanizing people, understanding we're in relationship and showing people how we want to relate. This is what I've seen as well. And I've also seen over the last year and a half, organizations, at least 3 organizations I work with, have changed their personnel manual and policy around bereavement leave. And they're allowing folks to be out in response to the world. So not just my grandfather died, which is an important, people need more than 3 days to mourn that, right? But I'm going to acknowledge the chaos and the disruption and the overwhelm of the nervous system and give this person time off and institutionalize it. I think that is radical. I think it's necessary. I think it's radical that people are doing this. So that's one way that I've seen people. It's not necessarily a grief practice. It's acknowledging grief, and there are many other ways through ritual, as I said, to engage in a grief practice. And I also think about, and many of us are not in person, and when we are, again, I think about structure and like, what does it mean to be in a meeting in a circle? versus behind desks. And what does it mean to see each other and witness one another and ask the question, how is your heart? Or to model as a leader, I'm grieving what's happening in the world. Are you?
Yes.
Right? These are practices that I've seen and want to see more of.
Where do you see this, when you say collective in terms of, healing our collective grief, what are the structures that you see developing around that?
Mm-hmm. Well, what's coming to mind is Sangha and community, right? And what we were talking about around ritual and what is in our bloodline around rituals that we, I'm actually writing another book about this, and all of the practices are meant to be practiced in space with others because it's all about healing together. Our suffering is bound, and we can also heal together and move through it. And so I feel like we need to get back to that witnessing in the way I was talking about, and back to our different rituals, and to acknowledge our ancestry is intertwined and playing out all of the time. So that's one practice I feel like that could be in place. But what your question made me think about is cultural trauma and how we are all moving through something together, not having the same experience, but our consciousness has been shifted. Who we are has changed, right?
Yes.
Just because of the way we're relating and connecting. Our brains have changed, our hearts have changed, right? And transformed in all of these ways. And we're holding this together. And so I think a practice is acknowledging that, right? Instead of saying, we're in this together, which we are when I think about humanity, but we're not moving through it in the same way. We're not holding the trauma in the same way. So much of the grief work that I have read about and been encouraged to engage in is about the individual, which is important. I want to honor our individual trauma. And I really want people to think about, how is my grief connected to someone else's, or like their grief, to deepen that conversation.
It's beautiful. Let me find the next question. What would be a solid first step in incorporating a turning away from white supremacist structures and systems when working in with or interacting with organizations? So how do we turn away while we're inside the organization? And how do we build when it doesn't seem like we can dismantle these structures and systems?
I think this is an interesting question, because what I invite organizations to do is to turn toward and see how the patterns of white supremacy are present in the space. Because if we can't see it, sense it, we can't acknowledge it. And if we don't acknowledge it and how toxic it is as a system and how it's harming us all, we won't change it. And so I think we first need to be like, how is this present in this space, in this organization? How has white supremacy become institutionalized here? What are we doing to people? How do people feel in this space? And that's diagnostic, right? Then we can ask and assess and practice together new patterns. What are the antidotes to white supremacy is often what I ask groups as well. Once they've identified how the patterns of white supremacy are showing up, then what do they want to practice with one another instead of these things? And what will they do when they are sort of pushed to default to old patterns instead of lean into the new ones? Which crisis, pressure, deadlines make us default to conditioned behaviors and responses and tendencies. And so these are the questions that I ask organizations, and also center the voices of the folks who are most impacted, because they actually know how power is working. Like the people who are furthest out in the margins and furthest away from power know how power works, because we can see it. We can see how we don't have it. We can see how it's been taken away. So listening to those voices and uplifting those voices as well. And I have to believe we can dismantle these structures. Like I would not be able to do what I do if I didn't have any hope. And so it does at times feel like everything's in the way. And then I remember my grandmother, Dorothy, or my great grandmother, Angie, or my mother, Clara, or the organization that did make change, right, in so many ways, or the people that I get to be in space with who are committed to this. And that's what I call on. I'm wondering if my internet got frozen or if Janae's did.
We're starting with the grassroots, if you will, but how do we engage leadership? Oh, frozen for a moment. Let's see.
You're not frozen anymore, but
Okay, great. How do we engage the leadership is the question. Because a lot of the times it is the people on the margins who know. In my own organization, it is moving this trauma work, trauma-informed systems initiative, and the mindfulness work was championed by a couple of leaders. And they're gone, by the way, from the organization, so they're not even there anymore. And so it's like we're having to build a case from the bottom up.
Mm-hmm.
How do we engage leadership?
Mm-hmm. Were you answering the question, or were you asking?
I was asking. How do we engage? Yeah.
I mean, I think we sort of shift our paradigm around what leadership looks like. That because many people have been conditioned to lead and act like they know when they don't know, and conditioned out of being humble. And as leaders, people need to be humble and need to model what they want to create and need to do it collaboratively. And so many times leaders need to understand how the work will benefit them. And I want to be like, it's going to benefit your soul and your spirit and every part, the ethos of this space and the other relationships you have, because dismantling racism and oppression, this is transformative work. It's not, this is my colleague, Carrie Kelly, and I always talk about, it's not transactional.
Yes.
It's transformational. So inspiring leaders and supporting them in understanding the value of transformative work.
Excellent. Helping them to reconnect to their own humanity. Yeah. Next question. Can you talk more about loving people that have hurt us, like a parent who is too painful to be around?
I want to say that I have this practice that is from Stephen Cope and Kripalu, which is called the wave. And it's really about the wave of experience, and that every experience is like a wave, and that we have these ways we jump off the wave, and we need to understand what those are. And sometimes if we stay, that a karmic knot will be untied. There's a lot more, but I'm saying this because every time I introduce the wave, I tell people that sometimes we need to jump off the wave. So what I'm going to say is sometimes we need to set a boundary, because there's no way for us to heal and be around the parent, the person, the experience, the pattern. That this is what I invite people to think about. How do I want to stay and show up, and what do I need to stay for? And so I would invite you to, and I don't know the situation, but to set a boundary and know that that's a loving act towards yourself and perhaps for this person too, because there's learning in setting that boundary. And with parents, I mean, that's a challenge, right? With family who we chose in a spiritual way, but we didn't choose them in this way, and all the pain and the trauma that can come along with family. So that, and I would say honor your tenderness if it's present, and as we said, tend the heart, care for the heart and what you need. If you feel like being around this person, parent, will continue to be triggering and overwhelming for the nervous system.
Excellent. Next question. Thank you for all your beautiful work and for this conversation. How do you think gratitude has helped you heal from grief? And how do you think it has enhanced your spiritual practice?
This gratitude practice came to me when I was in a moment of crisis. Everything had been disrupted. I was about to move across the country. I was getting a divorce. moved across the country. My father transitioned, my grandmother transitioned. But I remember the moment I was sitting at a table and calling for a practice. And gratitude is what came to me. And so I started writing 10 gratitude statements a day and noticed a difference in my energy and spirit and how I related to self and others. And this is great because it's a good reminder that we were talking about the grief is not going to swallow us. We are having other experiences. So when I look at what am I grateful for today, like last night, I was on Zoom for 9.5 hours yesterday. And at the end of the day, I walked outside and I connected with the garden and I saw these bees sleeping on the flowers, right? And I saw the chickens making all this noise and the bees bearding on their hive and getting water. And it was this, it was so healing to take a moment to do that. And I was so grateful for the space, like to get to be in communion with all of the beautiful things here in my space and what feels like a sanctuary. And so gratitude it reminds me, it expands my perspective. When the chaos of the world really can sort of limit and make me contract, gratitude allows me to expand.
That is beautiful. And we have that in common. I do a gratitude practice every morning in my journal because it just does that. It opens up the space. It helps me to see things in a more, I'm going to say, realistic way. Because and it also up levels my vibration, so love it. Girl, I knew that Johnson thing. So last question. What's next for you and for the movement and the culture?
So many things. One is the book I'm writing right now about, I don't know what the title will be, the publisher will decide, but the working title is We Heal in Community. And so I'm working on that and bringing in other voices, different folks who, and Janae, I'm going to talk to you about this later, but folks who are doing this, right, and aligned with the need for us to practice rituals, the need for us to work with ancestors, the need for us to dream together and vision together. So I'm excited and very involved in that writing project. And I also want to say I'm led by my intuition and ancestors. And what that means is I will get information and then I will listen and respond. And I don't exactly know what's next for me, because I know my ancestors at some point will tell me what's next, and I'll be guided by them, or spirit will tell me. This is really how I move in the world. I mean, I'm intentional and on purpose, and know that something bigger is guiding me in the way I spoke about something bigger supporting me. And I think for the movement and the culture, what I said earlier about, in particular, COVID-19 is, and all that goes along with it, it is really asking us how we want to be. It is doing a lot. It's ravaging through, it is disrupting and destroying. And in so many ways, it's showing us some of the patterns we have been engaged in as a culture for a long time. It's revealing, right? So many people have talked about this. It's uncovering. And I think we need to decide how we are going to be. So
Yes.
I think that's next, being with that question and then responding, right? Once we receive an answer, collectively being with that question, how do we want to be?
Yes. Do you have a simple mantra for us? You have several in here that
I do.
Just a simple one that we could take away.
Yeah. This is in chapter 3. It's the chapter about my dad and working in an organization that was not prioritizing care. And the mantra is, I am whole, I am healing, we are whole, we are healing. It's on page 64.
Yes.
So this is the mantra that I'll offer. I'm whole, I am healing, we are whole, we are healing.
It's beautiful, and I have it highlighted too. I am whole, I am healing, we are whole, we are healing. It's been a pleasure to be with you, Michelle. Such a heartwarming pleasure. I hope you all have enjoyed this beautiful sister and have just taken in this gorgeous heart work and let it heal and replenish and restore you and get some rest behind it. Thank you for tonight. I'll turn it back over to Alex.
Thank you all so much for attending this evening. We hope you'll join us for more of our upcoming talks and workshops. This conversation was recorded tonight, so if you would like to watch it again or share it with your community, it will be available on our YouTube channel at this very same link and on our Facebook page. We will also feature this talk on our podcast, which you can find at www.ciispod.com or by searching CIIS Public Programs on your favorite podcast app. Thanks again for joining us and have a wonderful evening.